So we're going to start by reviewing all these positions. And it may seem like a lot of positions, it may seem kind of overwhelming, but you can review the positions by watching that part of the lecture multiple times. And I'll also review them and talk about their relationships by presenting a table at the end of all those that summarizes the positions and their relationships to each other. After we do the summary and exposition of these positions, we want to turn our attention to the arguments and analyses of arguments that we find in this chapter. And so the first argument that we're going to want to look at is an argument for normative moral relativism. And the argument can be understood as going from descriptive moral relativism to meta-ethical moral relativism, inferring its truth, and then arguing from meta-ethical moral relativism to normative moral relativism. And so I refer to the argument in this way. Rachel's refers to the argument as the cultural differences argument. So we'll go through that argument and we'll look at how it's supposed to work, what its premises are, and the conclusion that it hopes to establish on the basis of those premises. Then we'll look at Rachel's response to that argument. Right? He wants to claim that the argument from descriptive moral relativism is in fact invalid. And he's going to argue for that by giving us a counterexample that's essentially the same counterexample that we saw when we looked at moral skepticism earlier in this course. Then he's going to turn his attention to arguing that, in fact, the premises, or at least some of the premises, in the cultural differences argument are false or likely to be false. And this is going to serve two purposes, right? It will establish that the argument is unsound. It's invalid, also has likely false premises, but it will help us to understand why the argument is invalid by showing how the premises don't necessarily imply the truth of the conclusion. So how does he do that? Well, he's going to look at socio-historical and environmental factors and look at their relationship to shared moral values in determining different moral codes or practices in the society. So he's going to look at those indigenous people that were once referred to as Eskimos as his primary example in this case. And he's going to focus in again on infanticide. And this time what he's going to want to do is argue that the practice of infanticide is not necessarily indicative of different values, moral values assigned to human life. That infanticide emerges not directly from a consensus moral value within a culture, but through a combination of social, historical, and environmental factors, as well as shared moral values. So he's going to want to suggest that all of the societies that prohibit infanticide, as well as societies that allow for it or have allowed for it, they all share a moral value of human life, but how that moral value gets cashed out in terms of practice can differ as a result of the historical factors, the sociological features, the environment, and so on. And so he's going to offer an alternative explanation for why particular societies might engage in the practice of infanticide, why their moral judgments about infanticide seem to be different. And he's going to want to create a space whereby we can explain the differences in moral codes across societies without supposing that they in fact have different moral values, that they could have the same moral values but have different moral codes nonetheless. After giving that argument, he's going to then turn his attention to formulating and presenting an argument against moral relativism. And we'll look at that argument and talk about its logical structure. And specifically, what Rachel's is going to want to argue is that if metaethical moral relativism were true, then there are a number of consequences which seem strongly counterintuitive. They do not seem to be correct views about morality. And if they contradict what we intuitively find to be true, then we should reject that original assumption that ethical and normative moral relativism is, in fact, a true view about the nature of ethical judgments and the normative implications that would follow from that view. So, what are those three things? These three contradictory implications that he wants to highlight. Well, he wants to argue that if metaethical moral relativism is true, then it has the implication that there really isn't any means for us to have intercultural moral normativity. So there would be no way for us to criticize other cultures' practices or for other cultures to criticize our practices, because the two practices are made true or false within the context of those cultures. And since it's not a shared culture, there is no shared basis for disagreement. It doesn't make sense on this view for there to be intercultural moral normativity. And he thinks that's very counterintuitive. It doesn't jibe with what we think about when we think about our ethical views, and hence it provides us with a reason to reject metaethical moral relativism and its normative component, normative moral relativism. Similarly, he's going to want to argue that metaethical moral relativism and normative moral relativism have the implication that there could be no intercultural moral disagreement. That is, within a culture, what counts as the correct moral judgment is simply what the culture agrees on. It's simply what the practices are. And therefore, people can't sensibly disagree within a society about what the appropriate moral judgment is with regard to some action. The appropriate moral judgment is, what the correct course of action is always determined by the consensus moral practice. Finally, he's going to want to argue that if metaethical moral relativism is true and its normative component, normative moral relativism is true, then we can't really make sense of the notion of moral progress or reform. Right? The idea that ethical practices can change because of reasons, that we can change the way that we conduct ourselves to bring ourselves in line with a true norm, whereas we were practicing under an incorrect or misperceived norm before, that can't be made sensible. So the idea that we now no longer allow slavery in Western societies, and that is a reform, a change in our moral practices that reflects progress, that reflects a recognition that slavery is objectively wrong, we can't make sense of that in the context of metaethical moral relativism, normative moral relativism. So the argument here is that these views, these moral relativistic views, have consequences that contradict our strongly held ethical intuitions, our ethical beliefs, and as a result, they either have to be rejected, those intuitions, those strongly held beliefs, or we should reject the assumption of moral relativism. So in the next section, we'll start going through and looking at the terms and how we want to understand them and their relationships to each other.